Welcome to the 28 Minutes of Sanity disclaimer. Paul and I have been doing this podcast for a few months now, and we're having a blast. We're really thankful for the great guests that have agreed to come on. We're always on the lookout for people who have something interesting to say that is connected to the Christian worldview. And at times we do wade into subjects that might be uncomfortable or controversial. So just want to remind you that anything our guests say may not reflect the views of Heartland Church or Heartland's leadership. As always, if you have a question or a concern, feel free to reach out to us. The coffee's on us, and we thank you for listening. And welcome to the 28 Minutes of Sanity podcast. This is JJ. Paul's here as always. We're glad you're joining us today. If you want to follow us on Twitter, you can go to @28min of Sanity if you want to send us a note, a question, a comment, a criticism. 28 Minutes of Sanity @gmail.com. I'm really excited today. We have a guest today who I think you're going to really enjoy hearing from. Our guest today is Doug Axe. Doug is the author of Undeniable: How Biology Confirms Our Intuition That Life is Designed. And he's graciously agreed to give us some time today, so we're excited to have Doug on here. Doug, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well.
Good. We really appreciate your time today, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Just to kick things off, Doug, can you just give us your story a bit? Tell us a little bit in a minute or two or three who you are and what you're doing these days.
Sure. So I'm teaching here at Biola University, started fall of 2019. We actually had one of our daughters come here, so she was a student when I started here. So it's been a delight being here. Love working with students. We moved from the Seattle area down to here. My sort of personal background and what brought me to where I am was not raised in a Christian home, and we were not a church-going family. And then within a space of a very short period in my teen years, so I was about 14 years old, my whole family became Christian, started attending an evangelical free church in the Bay Area in California. And I started wrestling with worldviews at that point and headed off to UC Berkeley to do my undergraduate studies, and was seeing this tension between the perspective of reality coming from the academic pulpit in various classes versus the scriptural view of reality that I was a student of, and a fairly young student of at that point. And that really got me interested in apologetics, and particularly in the possibility of using science for apologetic purposes. And I didn't know what that would look like, but eventually doors opened for me to move into molecular biology and to look at Darwinism, to look at whether the Darwinian mechanism can actually invent new things, specifically new functional genes. So that led me into the course that has been now a career of research, and it's been challenging, but also a lot of fun.
Okay. Well, thanks for that intro, Doug. I first became familiar with you a few years ago. I had read some reviews of your book, Undeniable, and I picked it up and really enjoyed it. Just a little level setting for you. My freshman biology class at the University of Nebraska, I got a C+, and that in and of itself was a miracle. And so I am not scientifically astute at all. And yet the argument in your book, I was able to follow pretty well. And so that's one of the things I appreciate about your book, is that it's got some technical stuff in it, but you do a fine job of explaining that. I guess maybe I'm going to ask the question this way. I want to see if I have summarized your book well, and I want you to critique this, but if somebody were to ask me, I just finished a second reading of it just yesterday. If somebody were to ask me about your book, Undeniable, I think I would tell them that it's an argument that we all have an intuition of design. And when we enter into the question of creation, evolution, design, things like that, that intuition can hold up through that experience, through the arguments that you might hear, highly technical arguments about fossils or DNA or whatever. Is that a fair summary of your book? And whether it is or not, can you just walk us through the argument that you make throughout your book?
Yeah, I start with that intuition
Hmm.
because I had actually started on the book. I was getting going on the book. I had a contract to write it when I came across the quote that I use in the book from Alison Gopnik. She's a UC Berkeley psychology professor, and she wrote in the Wall Street Journal, by elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists. So I thought this is intriguing. It's not parental input, it's not the input of teachers that's making people, young people, 4-year-olds, intuit that life was made by a godlike designer. Instead, it seems to be something that's inbuilt, it's something innate in us. And I started to think as I was writing the book, I should not be writing this book as a simplification of technical argument. Instead, I should see the main argument as being non-technical. And then I'll bring, as you said, I'll bring some technical things in and simplify them so that readers can be assured that you can go and do technical science and you only confirm what that 4-year-old knew, what all of us knew at age 4. So I was really interested in how might this operate in the mind, in the relatively uneducated, uncluttered mind of a 4-year-old when they see a butterfly and they intuit that this butterfly was made by a godlike designer. And I came to this idea that there are certain things that pop out when we see them as being beyond coincidence. And so I talk about invention, high level function, and then we unpack it and look at why is it that the things that have high level function, things that float around and look for flowers, in the case of a bee or a butterfly, why is it that those things invariably cannot happen by accident? And so I just unpack that in a simple way in the book. And then I show that you can look at things down to the molecular level in life and you see that same thing, things with a hierarchical structure that I call functional coherence. It's parts within parts, all of them align to accomplish some high level function. In the case of the 4-year-old seeing the butterfly, the high level function is acting like a butterfly, floating around with flapping wings and finding flowers to get nectar. Things that simple things like sand and grit and dirt and droplets of water and clouds are not capable of doing are done only by these high level things. So that turns out to be the pattern that I say is what not just young people, but all people are seeing. And when they see it, they're looking at something through the lens of a maker and inventor, because that's what we are. From a very early age, we're looking at things that other people have done, have made, even if we didn't see them make them, we recognize those things. And those are the things that we want to learn how to do. And I think it's that facility within us, that faculty, that allows us very quickly to spot the things that are clever and to know that it requires know-how to do something clever.
Okay. So that's a great summary of that intuition example being a bumblebee. Just so that our listeners can kind of get that locked in, do you have maybe a couple other examples of what you're talking about?
I use lots of examples in the book.
Mm-hmm.
One of them that I use when I'm speaking on this is if I say inventions can't happen by accident, then people are thinking about, well, you're talking about complex things that you get a patent for. And I'm using this in a much more broad sense to mean anything that requires some know-how to put things together just right so that you get a high-level function. And an example I use that everyone's familiar with is a text message. When you send a text message, there's something you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to tell someone something. Maybe you're arranging to meet someone for dinner somewhere, so they need to know when and where to
Mm-hmm.
meet you. And you do that by putting together letters to make words, words to make phrases, phrases to make a couple of sentences. And if it works, then the person meets you at the right place at the right time. And that's a high level function. Simple things don't do that. But you start with simple things like the letters of the alphabet. And if you know how to write in the language you're writing in, then you arrange those simple things into successively more complex things in order to achieve that top level goal. So a text message, any piece of writing would be an example. All of the things that you view as inventions, like your smartphone and automobiles and home appliances, these are all very complex inventions, but so are things that we do ordinarily, like writing, speaking, things like that.
Okay. Okay. So we have this design inference or design intuition. Um, how how does that not carry over into the scientific endeavor then? What has happened? How would you explain why is it hard for the arguments you're making to take hold in the dominant scientific community?
Yeah, this is something that I had to get my head around myself, because if you're going to be puzzled viewing this controversy, this dialogue, this debate between design and Darwinism, if you think that science is about objective reasoners reasoning and observing their way to the truth. So if you view science in purely idealistic terms, and I agree that's what science should be, but if you view science in those purely idealistic terms, you would expect that where there is evidence against a theory, that the evidence will be acknowledged, and where it's compelling, the theory will be revised or dropped altogether, and science will move on. But science isn't practiced in the ideal way, because guess what? It's practiced by non-ideal people, people who are products of a fallen world. They are, in general, in rebellion, in some measure of rebellion against God, against the Maker. Everyone is wanting to go their own way. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that we were made by a personal designer God, and that therefore we're accountable to that God. And there's other more complex things that are political within the scientific establishment. Even people who acknowledge that God is real, they don't want to get in trouble in their work. And so they're very observant, and they notice if so-and-so is speaking out against Darwinism over here, and someone else is speaking over there, and they both get punished. Well, I don't want to get that kind of punishment. So they modify their behavior the way humans do within a cultural context where there's, it's like cancel culture is what we call it now. Punishment given to outliers, people who are deviating from what's considered to be the appropriate or acceptable norm. And that actually drives a lot of scientific behavior. And it sounds that sounds surprising to people who are thinking of science in idealistic terms. But when you get to know scientists and you go do science, you see that's exactly how science operates. It's a very human operation.
That makes a lot of sense, and that makes a lot of sense, I think, of what so much of what we see in the world is. My mind goes to the term groupthink and the power of groupthink so often. Now, Doug, in your book, you spend a fair bit of time just telling personal stories about the price that you've paid for kind of swimming upstream on these things. Do you care to talk about that for a moment? Just kind of what a couple of things come to mind is how have you been able to break free of that groupthink? And also, you mentioned people in the scientific community who maybe in their hearts agree with you, but aren't ready to pay the price of publicly acknowledging that. It's kind of two questions in one. What does that look like, or how does that manifest itself?
Sure. So in my case, I tell the story in the book, so it's not a secret. I felt called to pursue this. And when I say this, I mean a project where I was examining the information content in individual genes in bacteria. And I was very purposefully trying to put a number on the probability of getting a functional gene by a blind search. And that number would have huge implications for the plausibility of Darwin's theory, because if the probability is too low, then it's not going to be possible for a blind search to find new genes which encode new proteins. And indeed, I found a number that is frighteningly small for the probability if you're a Darwinist, and it's 1 in 10 to the 77th power. This is roughly the odds that a randomly stitched together string of amino acids, that's how you make a protein, would fold up into a coherent structure and perform a biological function. 1 in 10 to the 77th power is roughly 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. It's frighteningly small probability, way too small for any living species of any kind to have come up with that kind of solution. And in life, we see, even in the simplest life, we see hundreds or thousands of solutions like that. So it would compound that number even further. I was in the middle of this work in 2002, and I was a victim of intelligent design becoming very political in the UK. I was working in Cambridge at the time at the Medical Research Council Center, and intelligent design hit the headlines because of a couple of schools in the UK that were teaching intelligent design along with evolution, and some parents or students complained, and it became a big political issue in the UK. Tony Blair was prime minister at the time. There was debates in the House of Commons. And as this was going on, it was all over BBC radio. Everyone was talking about it. I felt very vulnerable in my position because I was being funded by Discovery Institute up in Seattle, which was being named as the key funder for work in intelligent design. And it didn't take long for a journalist for a New York newspaper to connect my name to this controversy. And when that newspaper article came out, I got an email the next day from the assistant to the director of the center where I was working, saying, we need you to leave. There's a space crunch, and we need you to leave within 2 weeks. So it wasn't as though a proper reason was given for me having to depart, and I was unable to find the director of the center. Sir Alan First was his name. I'm on good terms with him.
Good.
By the way, since then. But I was unable to find him for the conversation that would have given me kind of closure as to what was going on there. And that's how that's how my time there at the Medical Research Council ended. Now, at that point, I went home and I prayed as I had never prayed before. I knew the Lord had called me to this work, and I was unable to keep doing it. And so I just brought that before the Lord, and a wonderful solution was provided. A door was opened for me to continue the work. And that became the project that I was working on at the time, became a paper that was published in 2004 in the Journal of Molecular Biology. That's the one that gives this 1 in 10 to the 77th power probability. So you asked a second question about how this operates within the scientific community, even people who might be sympathetic, and why they might maybe unwittingly be part of suppressing the truth. Was that the gist of the second question?
Yeah, I think you mentioned, some of the scientific community do agree with you, but they're not comfortable going public with that. And maybe my question is, what do you think it would take for more and more scientists to begin to speak up, to see a positive path forward, that it wouldn't be a career disaster? It would be a wise move to say, you know what, I actually agree with Doug, and these naturalistic explanations for things simply don't hold up. What do you imagine that looking like?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I've been wondering about this for decades. I do think, based upon my experience in conversations, that close to a majority, if not a majority, of life scientists are not at all convinced with the Darwinian explanation and are very willing to consider design as being a better explanation. However, they are intimidated and they are frightened at the thought of having their careers derailed. So when they see people who are removed from a position, as I was removed, understandably, they think, I'm in this position, I have to put bread on the table.
Yep.
I can't afford to stick my neck out and suffer the consequences. So I'm going to stay quiet and keep my job. I'll do what I can. Some of them think I can in small ways raise conversations and question things, but I'm not going to do something in a crazy way. Mm-hmm. And that's understandable. We counsel people who are in their graduate school years, getting their PhDs, and we tell them, by we, I mean me and my colleagues, we have regular gatherings of students up in Seattle annually and have had hundreds of students come through who are interested in this. And we tell them, don't do something crazy that will cause you to not get your PhD. Instead, stay the course, get properly trained, try to get into a position where you've got some ability to do things and change the way people think. And then as you get sort of some security, you can consider what it would look like to sort of come out on this subject and challenge the status quo.
Okay. So as people, that's something that people can be praying about, that, there's more and more scientists who can see the things you're saying, and it's clear to them, would ultimately be willing to risk whatever it would cost to speak up, because this is so important.
Yeah, and you can imagine a point where, a few universities, even mainstream universities, might become more open, or a couple of departments here and there might be the leaders and become open to this. And then it would become much less of a career risk. And then I think you would get hundreds and hundreds of people who say, yeah, all along I was not buying Darwinism. But until that happens, it's very hard. It's hard to know whether that will happen,
right,
or certainly when it will happen.
You can envision it, but you've been waiting for that for a long time, right?
Yes.
And you start to wonder, is that tipping point or that preference cascade going to happen? Having read, what you've done, and I first got familiar with some of these ideas in reading William Dembski, but that number 1 in 10 to the 77th, our minds can't quite grasp, once a number hits a certain point, it's like, that's just an awful lot. How do you contextualize that? Or how do you kind of show your work on that to help somebody understand what exactly does that number mean, and why is it so significant? Could you kind of slow walk through that real quick?
Yeah, and you nailed it. We don't, as humans, we deal with numbers that are more like, tens to hundreds to thousands, maybe a million. I would even argue that we don't have a good intuition for numbers as large as a million. So how on earth would we get our heads around a number like a trillion? We're just not going to do it.
Right.
I can give pictures that give an accurate portrayal of what a probability of 1 in 10 to the 77th power would look like. But I'm just shifting from a numerical incomprehensible thing to a picture that's almost as incomprehensible. For example, if you think of blindfolded throwing a dart and hoping that it hits a target, the probability of it hitting the target is going to depend on how big the wall is and how big the target is on the wall. And if the target is 1 part in 10,000 of the wall, then blindfolded, you'd expect about 10,000 darts. If they're thrown blindfolded, roughly 1 will hit a target. If you want to consider what would that look like for hitting a target of 1 in 10 to the 77th power, the wall would be the size of the sphere enclosing the visible universe, and the target would be the size of a hydrogen atom on that wall. So if I put it in those terms, nobody can actually picture a sphere that large, and nobody knows how big a hydrogen atom is, not intuitively. These are way beyond our intuition. But if I put it in those terms, everyone goes, oh, okay.
That's pretty much zero. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. Are there any other common, I know that I've seen some relatively ad hominem type of attacks. Are there any other common kinds of pushback against your argument, against your case, that you think would be good to address here at the moment?
The biggest pushback, or the biggest argument against undeniable, it's actually something that I anticipated. It's along the lines of Axe is trying to say that intuition is as good as science, or better than science. So Axe is saying that we don't need to do science, we can just go with our intuition, which is not what I'm saying at all. And you might wonder, well, why did I bring up intuition at all? Well, I think it's interesting that we do have this intuition and that it's universal and that it's acknowledged to be universal. So wouldn't it be interesting if something that's just innate in us is actually reliably pointing us in certain contexts to the truth, and not just any old truth, but to a very important truth, namely that we are not cosmic accidents. We were made by a godlike designer, as Alison Gopnik said. Wouldn't that be interesting? So I think that's exactly what we're seeing. Something that is an innate intuition. I'm not claiming that our design intuition is infallible. I'm claiming that in certain contexts, we do a very good job, we meaning humans, do a very good job of discriminating things that can't happen from things that can happen, with some gray boundary in the middle.
Sure.
But it turns out you don't need to worry about that gray boundary, because in looking at living things, we're way beyond the gray boundary. We're way into the zone of things that can't possibly happen by accident.
Okay. That's really helpful. And I want to move on to a different topic, Doug, but just want to mention again, the book Undeniable is a really helpful summary of everything that we're talking about, and it's very readable. Most of it is non-technical. But so Doug, I became aware of you when I started seeing some reviews for Undeniable. And then within the last year and a half, I became aware of what seems to be an unrelated work called The Price of Panic. And it came on my radar primarily because I've been somebody who appreciates the work of Jay Richards for a long time. And I've been very familiar with what Jay has written over the years, and I recognized your name from Undeniable and another gentleman named William Briggs. Can you just give us, in a completely different, what seems unrelated, but my hunch is I don't think it is unrelated. What is Price of Panic, and how did the three of you come to put the book together?
Yeah. So the subtitle is kind of the key to The Price of Panic. It's The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. And that's really the thread, as you're probably guessing, that I see connecting Undeniable with The Price of Panic. In both cases, we go very, very badly wrong in science if we view science as an authoritarian structure where people who are speaking against some orthodox consensus are to be silenced, and everyone needs to follow blindly the orthodox consensus. That's exactly how Darwinism reigns, and that's how a lot of this COVID stuff went down. Early on, it didn't look like that. Early on, you had people expressing very different positions, even experts, about whether it was wise to shut down the world in order to avoid the spread of this virus, about the likely impact of the virus on humanity, all these things, which, if you think about it, there's no way we could have known. When something is brand new, we don't know. The science isn't there.
Right.
So you can get scientists who can give their opinions, and their opinion is informed by their expertise in their field. But early on, we had very different opinions being offered. And then in this unhealthy thing that we see so often recently, there comes to be one view that is called the consensus view, and it becomes the view against which dissent is not tolerable. It becomes the view that if you speak against, you're to be canceled. You're distributing, you're promoting misinformation, or worse, you're a danger to humanity, and you should shut up and go away. We should close down your Twitter account and all that stuff.
Right.
So it's the same sort of tactics that are operating in these two areas: Darwinism on the one hand, and after the first few months, there was this COVID consensus apparatus, this sort of authority structure, and we know the names Anthony Fauci and the World Health Organization and CDC. All of these bodies more or less align around a certain view of this pandemic and what it means for us and what we need to do. And then very quickly, everyone falls in line. Nobody wants to be seen as an outlier. The ones who are critiquing this view get silenced, mistreated. Their YouTube channels get closed down, and it becomes an unhealthy situation where we're only getting one view of information, and you have to dig around and find the sources to get someone who's critiquing that. And all of these sources, without exception, are vilified by the mainstream media. So that's the connection. How the book itself happened was when I saw this moving in what I consider to be an unhealthy direction in terms of the public dialogue in February 2020, late February, I think it was 2020. I reached out to Jay Richards, who's a friend of mine, and I said, let's have a phone conversation because I'd like to propose something to you. And what I wanted to propose is writing a book with him. And I felt as though someone needs to give a more healthy, balanced view of this. Not that the virus isn't real, not that the virus won't claim lives, but that there's a huge cost to taking extreme measures against the virus. If you send everyone home, supposedly for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, you're going to cause likely more damage than good. And I didn't see a healthy dialogue in the public sector over that balance. What's the likely benefit of taking extreme actions against this virus, and what's the likely cost? Instead, everyone was focusing very narrowly on what a few people were saying was the benefit, even though there were equally expert people saying that's not likely to be the case. So I called Jay, we had a conversation. He brought in William Briggs, Matt Briggs is his name. I still haven't met Matt. In fact, we wrote the book in 2 months using Zoom meetings and Google Docs. And it was an interesting experience because Undeniable was nothing like that. I spent 2 years methodically working through chapters. In this case, we had a contract and we had to, in April and May 2020, quickly put out a book so that it would come out in 2020. We were worried that we don't want a book to come out and everyone to have forgotten COVID.
Right.
That turned out not to be the case. But we did get the book out in 2020.
So if you've touched on this, but summarize again for us, it was generally at the point when you could see that we needed to have some big concerns over lockdowns, stay-at-home orders, shutting down schools, things like that, in a widespread kind of top-down manner. Just playing devil's advocate, if somebody were to come to you and say, Doug, we don't know how bad it would have been if we hadn't done that. So how can you say that it was a bad idea? How can you use the term catastrophe? How can you call it a catastrophe when it's possible it could have been much worse had we not done that? How would you respond to that kind of critique?
Yeah, that's not scientific reasoning, because it's never possible in complex societal things like this. It's never possible to have what you would consider to be a perfect scientific experiment where we'll have a New York that does lock down and an otherwise identical New York that doesn't lock down, and we'll compare them. You just can't do that with human things. So of course, if people are wanting to justify the lockdowns or the mask wearing, the social distancing, the vaccine, whatever, they'll say, oh, it would have been much worse had we not done this. But that's the same sort of reasoning that's used for superstition and all kinds of quackery. That's not scientific reasoning.
Sure.
You can't say that just because your theory predicts that it would have been worse had we not done this, that's correct. Your theory might be wrong. So I think a better pushback on that is, we should have known at the outset that it would be very costly to send everyone home for 2 weeks. It would be very costly to tell people that they can't go outside their houses, or that you can't have any more than this number of people in buildings and they have to be 6 feet separated. All of these things carry a cost, and we're now, and for years from now, going to be counting that cost. Given that, we should have very, very strong evidence for the lives that would be saved by the extreme measures. And that just simply wasn't there. It couldn't be there because no one could show what this virus was going to do. Early data coming out of Italy, you might remember, even before New York and New Jersey had their huge spikes and deaths in 2020, we were watching Italy because it had a huge number. But the mean age at death from coronavirus in 2020 in Italy was 79.4 years or something like that. And on average, there were 2 or 3 comorbidities, they're called. So these were people who were unhealthy in multiple respects and at or above the life expectancy age. So that picture that was coming out of Italy early in 2020 was saying, this is not like the Spanish flu epidemic of the early 20th century where young people were being killed. This is something that is compounding health problems in the elderly who are already somewhat unhealthy. And that's the main sector that needed to be protected. You don't close down the world for something like that. You identify the people who are most vulnerable, you protect them, and you let the world go on, because it's in everyone's best interest that you let the world go on, because that's what gives us healthcare and all the benefits of a productive and affluent society, is letting people go to work and letting people go to school. You shut that down, you're going to have a huge hit.
Okay. That's a good summary. So let me ask you this. If it's been, I think, a little over a year and a half maybe since this book came out, have you and the other two gentlemen, if you could do it today, is there anything you would do differently with the book?
The basic concerns that we were laying out are correct. I wouldn't change those at all. Mm-hmm. We didn't have a conversation about, or we had very little about the vaccine, for example, because there was talk of a vaccine. Mm-hmm. And there was early talk that a vaccine would be the way out of this. So, mm-hmm. But we didn't have the vaccine at that point. So we're talking pre-vaccine. Mm-hmm. So I think we saw the same sort of dynamics, unhealthy dynamics operating around vaccination and mandates of vaccination. Mm-hmm. As we saw with mandates of mask wearing and mandates of social distancing and mandates of stay-at-home orders. All of this is encroachment upon what we would have considered to be very basic freedoms. Whether you can leave your house or not is a very basic freedom. What you wear on your face is a very basic freedom. We had never before had an era where government told us these things. You must stay home these days. You can't leave until we say. And when you do leave, you need to wear a mask, and you can't come within 6 feet of other people. These are sort of crazy impositions and restrictions of freedom. And what was alarming to me was how few were the people who were in vocal opposition to this simply because it's an encroachment on freedom. So forget about the safety. I'm not saying safety isn't an issue. I'm saying freedom is an issue.
Right.
And if we don't realize that, we're going to lose freedom. Mm-hmm. And I think the precedent that has been set here, that health authorities now have the ability to shut the world down. Does anyone think they're not going to play that card again? I think they will. I'm standing here in the state of California, where we're still officially under Governor Gavin Newsom in a state of emergency. We had the Super Bowl here, and the Rams won. We had a massive crowd for that. Life goes on as normal. If you went anywhere here in California, you would say this doesn't look like an emergency. But those emergency powers allow the government to operate in a special way, and they're very reluctant to let go of those powers.
So how, given all that, given kind of how you've walked us through some of the challenges of accepting the idea that God created, accepting the idea that we're made for freedom, and that needs to be a value in all this, and you're outspoken on these things, you're kind of a minority voice. It feels to me kind of in the range of perspectives out there. How do you, I think we'll close with this. You said you've got a time situation, and we do too, just a bit, but so let me close with this, Doug. How in the midst of all this, how do you stay optimistic? How do you kind of keep swimming upstream in the face of what seemed like some pretty challenging headwinds that you deal with? How do you talk to yourself? How does your Christian faith sustain you? What does it look like to be an optimist in your shoes?
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think the Lord has really worked on me in this, and I reveal some of this in the book, Undeniable, that I had kind of a really high opinion of my contribution, and I felt like if I get this science right and I make the argument right, I'm going to topple this theory. And that's the way I thought. But I pin that to what I call the utopian view of science, a view of science that's very much this idealized view that scientists are all about the truth. So if you show them that something they believe is not true, they'll immediately abandon it and they'll ask you what is true. Well, it just doesn't work that way. It was a overly optimistic view of science and an overly inflated view of my own role, I think, and this got adjusted with time. And I reached a point where I had to realize, no, science is a very human thing. And either I'm going to say I don't like science because it's a human thing, or I'm going to have to embrace it as a human thing. And I've chosen the latter. Just the same way I want to participate in a society and I want to be a citizen in a world where much of what's going on is not what I think, it's not the way it should be. But I'm here to be speaking the truth and to try to have some influence. And it would be hugely frustrating if we didn't know how it all ends, but we do know how it all ends. And it's going to require a power that's way beyond my power. It's going to require a savior to not only die on the cross, which he did in order for people to be made right with God, but to bring about a restoration and a reconciliation, a redemption of everything that's been touched by the brokenness. And until then, we're going to be in this fractured world. So it's kind of like prophets, like Jeremiah. You're called to speak the truth. You're going to be hated for it, but that's not a reason to not speak the truth. And Jesus himself, I mean, of course, he's our ultimate example of someone who demonstrates and speaks the truth and is vilified for it. He has his followers, but his followers are intimidated by the world, and Jesus himself is held in contempt by the leaders of his day. So by his own teaching, we shouldn't expect, we will do well to be treated better than that, and we shouldn't be surprised on those occasions when we receive that kind of treatment.
Well, I appreciate that. I appreciate the perspective that your view of Christ, your view of God gives you and enables you to keep moving forward in the face of all this. And so, Doug, as we close off, I just want to say how much, as I've said, I appreciate the time that you've given us today, and I appreciate the writing that you've done and the courage that you've shown to speak out on some of these things. And I know our people are going to be praying for you, and we appreciate what you're doing. So thanks a bunch for your time today. Do you have, I forgot to ask you this, do you have a website or anything else like that you want to promote real quick that we can direct people to?
Well, Twitter's much in the news these days. People can follow me on Twitter. It's my handle there is @DougAxe.
Okay.
That's kind of what I'm not a huge Twitter user, but I put things out and people can contact me through there as well. Okay.
So that's DOUGAXE, correct?
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, Doug, thanks for your time today. And this has been 28 Minutes of Sanity. We appreciate you watching and listening, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks.